The courtroom wasn't just silent, it was holding its breath. Federal Judge Andrew H. Stones sat high on his bench, shuffling through paperwork, unaware that his entire career was about to change. The hearing had been scheduled as closed door. Just another quiet procedural matter, buried behind sealed case numbers and redacted memos. Few outside Washington even knew it was happening. But then, she walked in. The doors opened, and in stepped Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, 33 years old. Sharply dressed in a navy blue blazer, a briefcase in hand, and a look in her eyes that didn't belong in a politician's gaze. It was too steady, too cold, too deliberate. Court officers murmured. Legal observers shifted in their seats. The judge glanced up and smirked. "Congresswoman Crockett?" Stones said, his tone coated in casual condescension. "This is a judicial hearing, not a campaign rally. You might be in the wrong room." She didn't flinch. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Your Honor," she replied calmly. "And I'm here under a provision in the House Judiciary Oversight Statute, Section 218, Federal Authority Review." The smirk on Judge Stones's face faded just a little. For those watching, nothing about this moment made sense. What was a sitting member of Congress doing in a federal courtroom for a case that didn't have her name on it? Why was her presence authorized at all? And more importantly, what did she know that no one else did? Let's rewind. Judge Andrew H. Stones isn't just a federal judge. For over 20 years, he's been the man behind some of the most controversial decisions on voting rights, civil liberties, and constitutional interpretation in modern legal history. His courtroom has been nicknamed the Icebox for how quickly cases die in his hand, especially those brought by civil rights attorneys or grassroots organizations. Dismissals, procedural denials, sanctions, you name it, he's done it. To many, he's an immovable object, the ultimate gatekeeper of status quo, justice. But Jasmine Crockett? She was raised by a working-class family in St. Louis, battled her way through law school, and spent years defending those who couldn't afford defense. She wasn't just a politician, she was a courtroom warrior before she ever stepped into Congress. And for months, she'd been investigating something that terrified the old guard, judicial abuse wrapped in legal legitimacy. And now here she was standing in front of the very man she had spent months researching, watching, documenting. Judge Stones narrowed his eyes. "Congresswoman, with all due respect, I fail to see how this case concerns you." Jasmine stepped forward, placed her briefcase on the plaintiff's table, and looked up at him. "It doesn't," she said. "But you do." A few gasps rippled through the courtroom. "This hearing," she continued, "involves potential constitutional violations that have affected over 75,000 American voters. But what's more disturbing is not what the state did, it's what this court allowed to happen term after term under your oversight." Silence. "You think I came here with opinions?" Her voice was still calm, but sharper now. "I came with facts, dates, rulings, reversals, quotes, transcripts, patterns that suggest this courtroom hasn't been a place of justice for a long time." Reporters shifted in their seats. Court staff froze. Even the defense attorneys looked suddenly uneasy. Judge Stones leaned forward, visibly annoyed. "If you have a point, Congresswoman, make it. Otherwise, I suggest you leave before you overstep." Jasmine opened her briefcase. Inside wasn't just paper. It was the tip of something much bigger. "I'm not here to argue," she said. "I'm here to expose." And just like that, the room changed. This wasn't about a single lawsuit anymore. This wasn't politics. This wasn't even courtroom theater. It was the beginning of something much larger. Jasmine Crockett wasn't just confronting a judge, was challenging the very system he represented. And she had receipts. What came next would become the most shocking judicial confrontation in modern history. Before Jasmine Crockett said another word, the courtroom was already changing. The energy had shifted. The silence wasn't just stillness, it was anticipation, like the pause before a storm. What she had just done wasn't political theater, it was a warning, a line in the sand. And to truly understand what was unfolding, you need to know the two people now standing on opposite sides of that line. Because this wasn't just about a case. This was about power. Judge Andrew H. Stones had spent over 2 decades as a quiet giant of the federal judiciary. His resume was flawless Harvard law, a Supreme Court clerkship, 2 decades on the bench. But what made him powerful wasn't his background. It was how he used his position to shape the system from behind the scenes. To the public, he was respected. To insiders, he was feared. His courtroom was known as the place where civil rights cases went to disappear. Attorneys whispered about his rulings, about the unusually high number of dismissals involving voting rights, housing discrimination, and constitutional protections. Some even called it the icebox because once your case landed there, it froze. But Stones didn't need to raise his voice or break the rules. He operated quietly, methodically, and for years, he was untouchable. His rulings were always just inside the bounds of legal procedure. His reasoning always lined up with precedent barely. Complaints were filed. Investigations fizzled. The paper trail was clean, almost too clean. And when stories began to surface, stories of late-night calls from political operatives, stories of coordinated legal roadblocks, there was never quite enough proof. Just enough to raise suspicion, never enough to spark change. That was how Judge Stones survived. But then came Jasmine Crockett. She didn't arrive with fanfare. She arrived with a briefcase. And inside that briefcase was something Judge Stones had spent decades avoiding. Receipts. Over the past 6 months, Jasmine had assembled a quiet, disciplined research team. What began as a review of voter suppression cases evolved into something deeper. A pattern. A pattern of rulings that consistently protected the powerful and dismissed the marginalized. A pattern that pointed to one name again and again. She had the court transcripts, the timelines, the reversals, the language. But that wasn't all. There were also emails, internal communications from former clerks who had since stepped away. There were anonymous statements from attorneys who had once argued in front of Stones and were warned off the record not to pursue certain lines of questioning. And most damning of all, there were recordings, verified, time-stamped. On one of them, a voice matching Judge Stones could be heard saying, "These cases aren't about justice, they're about attention." And then, just barely audible, another sentence, "If we give them a win here, they'll come back for more." These weren't just words, these were red flags. And Jasmine Crockett didn't just bring them to court, she brought them to the record. When Stones tried to reassert control, she stood her ground. "Congresswoman, I will not allow this courtroom to become a platform for political grandstanding," he said. Jasmine didn't blink. "With respect, Your Honor," she replied, her tone steady but direct. "I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here to reveal the truth." And with that, she opened the folder. What happened next would shake the federal court system to its core. They thought she was bluffing. They thought she'd flinch. But what happened in the next 8 minutes didn't just silence a courtroom. It made headlines across the nation. Because when Jasmine Crockett opened her folder, she didn't just hand over documents. She flipped the power dynamic of the entire federal bench. Right there, in real time. If you thought this was just another courtroom clash, think again. This was the moment a sitting congresswoman turned a federal courtroom into a battlefield for truth, armed, not with rhetoric, but with evidence so sharp it cut through 2 decades of silence. Don't blink, because what you're about to hear next might just be the most important 8 minutes in American judicial history. The moment Jasmine Crockett stood and asked the court to pause proceedings, the room reacted the way it always does when someone challenges power. It laughed. Not loudly. Not from the public gallery, but from the bench. Judge Stones leaned back, adjusting his robe, and smiled the way only someone completely confident in their authority can. "Congresswoman," he said with that familiar tone of superiority, "you're not the presiding judge here. This case is about state procedure, not courtroom politics." But Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Then you won't mind if we enter a motion of recusal based on new evidence of judicial conflict of interest effective immediately." The temperature in the courtroom dropped. And that's when everything changed. With a calmness that felt surgical, Crockett pulled out the first document-signed affidavit from a retired court clerk. Not a guess, not an opinion. A sworn statement detailing direct communication between Judge Stones and an outside political group financially backing one of the defendants in the very case Stones was hearing. Gasps. Then came the second item, a printed schedule, verified by official visitor logs, showing Judge Stones had attended a private dinner 2 weeks before the trial began, with campaign donors connected to the voter suppression efforts under investigation. And then came the video. Jasmine paused. She looked at the judge, then at the gallery, then back to the screen. Your Honor, she said evenly. If this isn't relevant, I invite the court to say soon the record. The screen lit up. It was a grainy but clear security recording from a downtown hotel. The timestamp matched the logs. The video showed Judge Stones in conversation with two men, identified as executive officers from a political action committee, named multiple times in the civil rights complaints. No sound was needed. The visuals said it all. Judge Stones shook hands. Saturday at a table. Accepted a manila envelope. Laughed. Toasted. The courtroom froze. For a full 10 seconds, no one moved. Not the attorneys. Not the court staff. Not even Stones. Because now it was no longer about speculation. It was no longer about patterns. It was about proof. Hard, visual, irrefutable proof that the judge presiding over a civil rights case may have entered that courtroom with interests already compromised. And Jasmine Crockett had just put it all on the record. You could hear the air shift. After the video played, the courtroom didn't just go silent, it held its breath. For a moment, even the ticking of the courtroom clock felt too loud. Judge Stones didn't speak. He didn't blink. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. She calmly stepped forward and placed a second folder on the table. If the court would permit, she said, I'd like to enter into record several supporting documents, each verifying a pattern of compromised conduct tied directly to this bench. No one stopped her. Not this time. The first item she produced was a confidential email obtained through legal whistleblower protections. It was sent by a former judicial assistant, someone who had worked under Stones for over 5 years. The email detailed internal pressure from the judge to delay rulings in cases involving civil rights plaintiffs, specifically when elections were approaching. According to the assistant, Stones once said, "If we stall it, the urgency dies down." The courtroom murmured. Crockett continued. Next, she held up a copy of a ruling gone that, on its face, looked routine. But then she revealed the metadata, backed by sworn testimony from a federal IT officer. The ruling, which had been signed and entered officially, had been manually edited after the hearing had closed, something that violated strict judicial procedures. A small change in language had shifted the burden of proof entirely onto the plaintiffs, quietly weakening their legal standing without notifying counsel. This wasn't just misconduct. It was manipulation. But she still wasn't done. She produced a list of cases, one after another, all dismissed under similar pretenses, all involving either voter access, minority protections, or political gerrymandering. She had cross-referenced them against social and political donation records, and in over 70% of those cases, there was a link. The defense or associated firms were connected to a discrete legal coalition known as the Bench Circle, a network of judges and attorneys believed to influence civil rights cases through back channels. And at the center of those dismissals, Judge Stones. But then came the moment no one expected. Jasmine placed a small digital recorder on the table. She looked at the judge, then the court, then pressed play. The voice that filled the room was unmistakable. No. Bury the expert testimony. Make it procedural. If we give them the footage, they'll blow it up into something bigger than it is. Keep it narrow. Dilute the whole thing. Civil rights cases always sound worse than they are when you let the cameras roll. The voice was firm, confident, matter of fact. It was Judge Stones. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. The transcript showed that the recording had been verified by forensic audio analysts and timestamped just 2 weeks before the current trial began. The judge had been recorded instructing his clerk to water down admissible evidence in a case involving constitutional voting rights. Now, it wasn't just about ethics. It was about obstruction. It was about justice compromised at the source. And as the clip ended, a wave of shocked whispers rippled through the courtroom. Reporters dropped pens. The defense looked stunned. And Judge Stones just stared. Because in a single afternoon, his fortress of silence had been shattered. And Jasmine Crockett? She had just dropped the hammer. It didn't end with a gavel slam. It ended with a whisper. Judge Andrew H. Stones, once towering and untouchable, sat frozen in his seat. His hands trembled slightly on the bench. The recorder had just finished playing. Jasmine Crockett had said nothing more. She didn't have to. The evidence was now on the record. The silence was thick, no movement, no sound, just the weight of 20 years crashing down all at once. And then, Stones stood up. Without making eye contact, without a word to the courtroom, he adjusted his robe, gathered his notes, and walked out the side door. He didn't say adjourned. He didn't say recess. He just left. He would never return. Within an hour, his chambers released a statement through his clerk. Due to unforeseen health concerns, Judge Andrew H. Stones is taking an indefinite leave of absence from the bench. The legal world knew what that really meant. He was done. Outside the courthouse, the news had already gone viral. Footage leaked from inside the courtroom showed Jasmine Crockett calmly presenting the evidence. The clip of the recording Stone's voice instructing a cover-up spread like wildfire across social media. TikTok exploded first. Users paired the audio with slow-motion edits of Crockett setting down the recorder. The hashtag number Crockett vs. Corruption hit over 2 million views in a matter of hours. On Twitter, civil rights lawyers, law professors, and even former federal prosecutors weighed in. This is the most important courtroom moment of the decade. Crockett didn't just expose a judge, cracked the system. Major media outlets scrambled for coverage. CNN aired a special report before sunset. MSNBC went live outside the courthouse. Even conservative networks were caught off guard, struggling to spin the narrative. But it wasn't just headlines. It was a spark. By the end of the day, the Department of Justice announced an emergency review of Judge Stone's rulings over the past 10 years. The Office of Judicial Oversight released a rare midnight statement, confirming they were reopening multiple complaints that had been previously dismissed, due to lack of corroboration. Within 48 hours, it wasn't just about Stones anymore. Dozens of attorneys across the country came forward. Victims of judicial bias, civil rights plaintiffs, public defenders. One by one, they shared stories of cases that had mysteriously collapsed under questionable rulings. A new hashtag began trending. Number: Justice was blindfolded. Law students organized panels. Former clerks leaked more documents. Advocacy groups called for a national database of judicial misconduct. And at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett. She didn't give victory speeches. She didn't launch a campaign. She just said what needed to be said in an interview that night. This wasn't personal. It was systemic. One courtroom was the battlefield, but the war is national. The courtroom may have gone quiet, but the aftershock shook Washington. Within a week, Congress launched a bipartisan hearing into judicial ethics and abuse of power, and sitting at the witness table confident, composed, and unshaken was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. The room was packed. Cameras rolled. Legal scholars and journalists leaned forward as she opened her statement with just 5 words. The system protects itself too well. What followed wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. She laid out a timeline, a methodology, a process so precise, so well documented, that lawmakers on both sides were left with little to argue. This wasn't grandstanding. It was strategy. It was structure. It was accountability, weaponized by competence. The story spread far beyond Capitol Hill. Across the country, law schools began adapting new curriculum modules called the Crockett Protocol. Professors cited her tactics as a masterclass in legal research, procedural strategy, and institutional confrontation done entirely within the bounds of the law. What had started as one woman against one judge had become a case study in structural disruption. And then came the legislation. Proposed under rare bipartisan sponsorship, the Judicial Transparency and Ethics Reform Act called for public access to federal judicial records, independent oversight of judicial misconduct, and mandatory bias training across all circuit courts. For the first time in decades, reform wasn't just an idea. It had a name, and that name was Crockett. They called it the day the bench cracked. Not just because a judge stepped down, not just because a courtroom broke its silence, but because for the first time in a generation, the system flinched. Across major news outlets, anchors dropped their neutral tones. A young congresswoman just did what generations of attorneys only dreamed of. She pulled back the curtain on federal justice, and she did it with nothing but the truth. CNN special report. This wasn't a rebellion. This was a reckoning. MSNBC. Even conservative voices, while reluctant, couldn't ignore the facts. The evidence had been overwhelming. The voice on the recording was real. The timeline was airtight. There was no spin that could undo what had been put into the record. It wasn't just a legal win. It was a moral one. And Jasmine Crockett? She didn't throw a press conference. She didn't parade through headlines. She sat down, days later, for one interview. One camera, one chair, and said the line that would be quoted for decades to come. I didn't walk into that courtroom for politics. I walked in for justice. And justice doesn't need permission to show up. The moment went viral instantly. Law professors played it in their lectures. Activists printed it on protest signs. Late-night hosts replayed the clip in admiration. But beyond the cameras and the quotes, something deeper was changing. People began to ask hard questions of their courts, their judges, their institutions. Legal oversight committees, once symbolic, were suddenly flooded with case reviews. Attorneys dug into transcripts they once considered lost causes. And perhaps most remarkably, everyday citizens began reading legal rulings not as distant documents, but as reflections of what justice actually looked like when no one was watching. They weren't just watching now. They were paying attention. Years from now, scholars would look back on it not just as a courtroom event, but a cultural fault line. They would teach it in law school as the case that shifted expectations. The moment that proved even the most powerful gavel can be held accountable no with force, but with facts. They would name awards after it. They would write books about it. And they would remind young students everywhere that you don't have to raise your voice to be heard, you just have to speak with truth and precision. For Jasmine Crockett, the case became a turning point, but not a destination. She didn't seek the spotlight, though it found her anyway. She continued her work in Congress, pushing for deeper judicial reform, more transparency, and broader access to justice. But if you asked her what mattered most, it wasn't the law that changed, it was the silence that finally broke. For too long, she said, the courtroom was a place where power went unquestioned. But that day, we didn't just challenge power, reminded it who it really works for. And maybe that's why they called it the day the bench cracked. Because a single voice, in a single courtroom, holding a single folder, reminded a nation that truth still matters. That justice is still possible. And that one person armed with preparation, conviction, and courage can still walk into the darkest room and flip on the light. Thank you for following this journey. If this story moved you, share it, speak on it, build from it. Because justice isn't just something we wait for, it's something we fight for. And sometimes, it only takes one person to start the earthquake.